I think the interesting thing about Hurricane Maria, it was kind of the first big catastrophe that Donald Trump had to deal with in his presidency. He went the first 6 months of his presidency without anything particularly catastrophic happening. I mean, the Mueller investigation started, but that, in terms of exterior things happening. And the thing is that the way that he dealt with that disaster really tells you a lot about the way that he's dealt with subsequent disasters, including the current one, the pandemic across the United States.
It's now claimed more than 180,000 lives.
Indeed.
So take us through what happened through Hurricane Maria.
Yeah, so Hurricane Maria was really two disasters for Puerto Rico, which was where it mainly hit. The initial storm, which was enormous and catastrophic and really ripped across the island and destroyed, huge numbers of homes and everything like that. But then there was a second more destructive, in fact, disaster in terms of death toll, which was a bureaucratic disaster. Essentially, the US government and the Puerto Rican government attempted to deal with the disaster in a way that ended up leading to many, 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 many more deaths. And when Donald Trump visited the island 2 weeks after the hurricane, he was in very good spirits. You might remember the very famous pictures of him shooting paper towels into the crowd. You can see him doing it there. And he was sort of very upbeat about how the whole thing was going, and he gave himself an A+, and he was praising FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency, for the great work that they were doing. But by this stage, everything was really quite grim. Puerto Rico, which, let me remind you, is part of America, it's not a foreign country. These people are American citizens, and they were in really dire straits. Trump's emergency management people had devoted enormous amounts of resources to Texas and Florida for two previous hurricanes, leaving Puerto Rico with almost nothing. And despite the mayor of Puerto Rico and emergency management experts saying that what we need is an enormous federal government response here, essentially what they did was they put it out to private contractors. And, for example, they gave a $300 million contract to rebuild the entire Puerto Rican power grid to a company who had one staff member and no experience building power grids. And here's how the guy described how he secured that the contract.
I'm on LinkedIn.
You use LinkedIn to get a $300 million contract.
LinkedIn's going to love this, but yeah.
Yeah, so they took it off him once they realised he didn't know what he was doing, gave it to another company, which turns out appears to have bribed FEMA officials in order to get that contract. They are awaiting trial for that. Meanwhile, they couldn't even organise food. They asked a woman in Atlanta, who had no experience in this, to provide 30 million hot meals. She asked a wedding caterer to try and help her out with it. She managed to deliver 50,000 cold meals instead of 30 million hot ones. They also couldn't get tarps to the island to cover up the homes, which ended up being destroyed because essentially there was no tarps to cover the holes in their roofs. They tried giving it to a kitchen utensil company, a tobacco importer, who also ended up defrauding the US government for millions of dollars. They at least managed to get some tarps, but there was fraud along with it. Trump, meanwhile, was there praising the amazing job done by his officials.
Incredible job done by FEMA, done by the Coast Guard, the Army, and again, the job that's been done here is really nothing short of a miracle.
He said the main problem was how much it was costing the federal government and that he had averted a real disaster by keeping the death toll low. Have a listen.
Every death is a horror, but if you look at a real catastrophe like Katrina and you look at the tremendous hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that died, and you look at what happened here with really a storm that was just totally overpowering. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. What is your death count as of this moment? 17?
16 certified.
16 people certified. 16 people versus in the thousands.
Gradually, researchers went onto the island and assessed the real death toll and found that due to a lack of power in hospitals, clinics, supermarkets, a lack of medication, a lack of drinkable water, that had led to deaths far exceeding Hurricane Katrina, which is the one that he was comparing it to. Here's the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, talking about what caused all those deaths.
We are dying here. And I cannot fathom the thought that the greatest nation in the world cannot figure out logistics for a small island of 100 miles by 35 miles long. I am begging anyone that can hear us to save us from dying.
Researchers found that 3,000 people died, not just from the hurricane, but because of the disaster afterwards. Other estimates were even higher. Donald Trump said that the people who'd made those estimates were Democratic operatives trying to make him look bad.
So that imploded for the people of Puerto Rico, but also for Donald Trump. So how did this reflect his strategies with dealing with other crises over the subsequent years?
Well, he lied about it. He basically said that any bad news about the Puerto Rican disaster was just a smear campaign against him. It wasn't real. It was fake news and that sort of thing. And really, for ongoing through other disasters, he has followed that, downplaying the level of a disaster when it starts to make him look bad. And that's something that we have really seen a lot with the pandemic.
And how effective has that strategy been?
Well, fairly effective for him, really.
And how?
Well, I guess the thing is that there's a big lack of trust in the media in the United States from Donald Trump's supporters, and Donald Trump is really good at at claiming that everybody is lying and making things up, to damage him. And there's a certain portion of the American public that are going to believe him no matter what he says, basically.
And so with your initial podcast was Russia, If You're Listening. And when you started out doing that, and there were so many threads to that, do you think at that stage you would have been pretty surprised at the end of that no mud actually stuck really on Donald Trump instead in terms of charges being laid or anything like that? And if that's the case, how does he stand now ahead of the US election?
Well, yeah, no mud stuck on that with Donald Trump, and as it has been with most of the things that have happened in the US until the pandemic, which does seem to have affected his popularity to a certain extent. And it was, I don't know that it was a surprise what ended up happening with the Mueller report. It was basically this bizarre situation that nobody understood, and thankfully, they really looked into it. In terms of mud sticking, this podcast is not about trying to bring Donald Trump down. We do talk about some of his achievements during the podcast. We're going to talk about the way that he addressed the trade war with China. We're going to talk about the tax cuts that he really lauds as one of his big achievements. But really, this podcast is about showing the way that Donald Trump being in office has changed the way that the American presidency works, and the way that Americans see themselves and see the presidency, and the way that the rest of the world sees America as well.